Hi, I'm a 4-mana planeswalker with a ninjutsu ability. Kira!
Hi, I'm committing crimes and reenacting them. Maya.
This weekend is MagicCon Chicago, and we are going back to the Pro Tour for the first time since October of last year. And in light of the Pro Tour this weekend, we wanted to give you a little bit of bonus content, discussing our general excitement, our thoughts, and predictions for the weekend.
It's been a while since we've had our last Pro Tour, and I, for one, am palpably excited. I am really excited to talk about not only what I think the metagame will look like, but what my pick for the best performing deck is, for the best card of the tournament, and just the thing I'm most excited to see. And I'm interested to see what your thoughts on this are as well, because we have such different views of Standard as players, and as players who think about the game from a professional mindset, that I think, while we might have similar rationales, I think where we end up might be quite different.
Let's start off by rewinding a little bit. What I want to do is take us back to the last Pro Tour for Magic Worlds at MagicCon Vegas, and this was October 25th and 27th. The field of Standard looked so different back then, and this was just shortly after Duskmourn released as well, so that was when we first got our Kaitos and our Enduring Creatures and our Overlords, and the set hadn't quite settled into the meta yet. We were seeing lots of new cards coming out left, right, and center, and it was very exciting to see where everything ended up in the meta. To give you a bit of a breakdown, the top 5 decks in terms of representation in the field were Gruul Prowess, Dimir Midrange, Azorius Oculus, Domain Ramp, and Temur Prowess. I've also included Dimir Demons, which came in at the number 6 spot because Dimir Demons is what ended up winning the Pro Tour overall. And seeing how these decks have remained in the meta, but have potentially shifted in their overall popularity and their overall representation at these events has been super exciting. Dimir Demons totally took the Pro Tour by surprise. There was not an expectation to see this deck perform the way that it did. The combination of Unholy Annex with cards like Bloodletter of Aclazotz absolutely shook things up. And it was very exciting. We hadn't seen this deck ever. And it was a deck that only existed because of the new Duskmourn release. And in that way, I very much see the deck having done so well because it was unexpected, which is what we've talked about a little bit previously, is in the way of if you're able to catch your opponent by surprise, if you're able to catch the meta by surprise, you're going to be able to run away with it a little bit.
There is a whole paradigm when it comes to professional level events in regards to hidden information when testing. Almost every pro team is looking to solve the format, and we can see it in professional level events, particularly with the level of deck diversity. They all come to different conclusions about what the metagame is likely to be and how to best play to solve it. It's a real balancing act, but it's also one of the things I love about Standard. The fact that the current metagame, even in a non-professional environment, is so vastly different from what it was a month ago, and certainly from October when Duskmourn was released, that it's fresh. I feel like we've played 3 different Standard formats over the course of the last 4 months.
It's changed so much. Even then, fast forwarding a little bit to the Spotlight series at SCG Con Atlanta, which was just last month, a little bit ago, January 3rd through the 5th of this year. And this is equivalent, I believe, now to Grand Prix.
The GPs of old.
They're back. They're back, and they're better than ever, I think, because they're Standard focused. So I'm happy to see that. But look, the way that the decks that were represented in the top changed a lot, even between those 3 months. And of course, we had Foundations in that interim period. But as we spoke about previously, Foundations, belying the term, was meant to build more of a foundation than to fundamentally change the format as it was. It was meant to provide a level of support consistently over the next 5 years. Hello, this is Editing Kira from the future. I am interjecting here to say that I grabbed the wrong information for the top 6 that I'm about to talk about at SCG Con Atlanta. What I thought was the metagame breakdown was actually a lovely metagame mentor article from Frank Karsten, who I referenced earlier for MagicCon Vegas. And this was his predictions for decks that we're going to see a lot of play. So I totally fumbled that one, and I apologize for the mix-up. Bear with me. We will be using the information that I saw from that one, but I will also put the actual metagame breakdown from Atlanta on screen now. Thanks. Here we go. That being said, The top 6 represented decks at that event ended up being Dimir midrange, Jeskai Convoke, Gruul aggro, Golgari midrange, Mono Red aggro, and then I've included Zur Overlords because that was somewhat similar to the domain ramp idea, but this was when the interaction between Zur and the Overlords was discovered, shall we say, and exploited.
It was certainly when it became the more powerful thing to do than casting Leyline Binding with Up the Beanstalk. Although that is still in the deck, I believe. The things that we lost were Herd Migration and Archangel of Wrath.
Additionally, as well, we saw Azorius Oculus completely fall off the charts. It went from being the 3rd most represented deck at Worlds to the 13th most represented deck at SCGCon. And that is a huge drop. Other decks that we mentioned, like Dimir midrange, went from number 2 most represented to number 1 most represented at SCGCon. Gruul aggro remained in roughly the same position. Gruul aggro and Gruul prowess kind of trading spots every now and again, just depending on how deck builders are approaching the archetype. But Azorius Oculus disappeared from the top 10 decks. And that was largely because, turns out, just playing Rest in Peace in your sideboard completely fixes all of your problems. And having any amount of graveyard hate or graveyard interaction really disrupts the plan that Oculus is trying to execute.
And it speaks to the nature of preparing for events, especially at a high level. Playing something that the field isn't necessarily expecting to be out in force gives you that advantage in the post-sideboard games where if you are playing Azorius Oculus and you think your opponents aren't expecting there to be a dominant graveyard strategy, then you are going to get percentage points by the fact that your opponents will not have built a sideboard strategy to accommodate the broken thing that you are doing. And as a result, you expect to put up results, and that's what we saw with Shota Yasuoka at Worlds, who did quite well with Azorius Oculus.
And what we're seeing over the long term, as you've mentioned before, is the prevalence of mid-range decks in a professional play space. The toolkit that pro players rely on is their ability to better execute a mid-range game plan than other players. And what we see as well in the most played cards across Worlds, we see Cut Down, Negate, Go for the Throat, Duress, and Torch the Tower. So an overwhelming representation of blue-black control strategies with a little sprinkling of a bit of red aggro in there.
You'll notice that every card on that list is a cheap piece of interaction, and that speaks volumes to the nature of the interactivity and the, for lack of a better term, the standard creature-based nature of the format currently, that it is a really good tool for letting us be informed about what we can expect to see at the Pro Tour.
Cheap, efficient interaction is vital at that level of play. These are all cards that are 2 mana or less, cards that, except for Duress, operate at instant speed, and give the player the opportunity to be proactive or reactive, depending on the situation. And so the versatility of those cards in those spaces, instead of something like Split Up or Day of Judgment, gives the user far more control over the game.
It's a game of agency, ultimately. How you choose to trade your resources with your opponents is often a very key factor in the outcome of any given game, and cheap, versatile, interactive spells creates a very strong cornerstone for what high-level professional Magic is often all about.
I will say I'm very surprised to have seen Jeskai Convoke so represented at the Spotlight Series. It's a deck that does well, but in my experience tends to crumble easily. And so seeing it as the number 2 deck of choice at this event, very surprising. Overall, of course, Gruul aggro ended up winning the event. A little bit unsurprising. We've seen Gruul aggro dominate for the last year or so. It has been quite represented in the meta, even prior to rotation last year, when we lost Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and we lost Tamiyo Safekeeping, we lost Kumano Faces Kakazan, and that was kind of the peak of Gruul aggro, or so we thought. But Gruul aggro has really monumentally improved with Duskmourn and Boon Wurrung. We've got all of the Valiant Mice, we've got Leyline of Resonance, we've got more protection spells and more interaction than ever before, it feels.
And some of the most resilient pump spells in the game, like Turn Inside Out.
Turn Inside Out, Monstrous Rage. Gruul is eating. Gruul is eating in Standard right now. And so seeing Gruul aggro and then at Worlds, Dimir Demons taking home the win, these are two, as I would say, unsurprising wins.
Dimir Midrange or Dimir Demons?
Dimir Demons won Worlds.
Yes.
And that relied on a late game mid-range strategy to have that final push.
I see.
Overall, though, yes, like Dimir Demons, the Demons list specifically outperforming Dimir midrange, which was, if we look at the numbers, Dimir midrange had a overall 16 players represented, where Dimir Demons specifically had a 9-player representation. So a difference of about 6 percentage points in the field overall. Seeing Demons win was a bit of a surprise, but the backup plan of being able, through the sideboard, to morph into a mid-range deck speaks to the power of mid-range. So that's looking back. That's looking at the events that we've seen in the last 3 months. We have MagicCon Chicago this weekend. Where do we think we're going now?
Strap in, folks. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, bringing us back to the big 4 questions that I personally would like to answer for you today, which is what I think the metagame will look like, our pick for the best performing deck, our pick for the best performing card, and the thing we're most excited to see. These questions are really fundamental in terms of what we think Standard will look like at the Pro Tour, and of course going forward, because Pro Tours have such a major impact on the way the Standard format evolves over time. Even if something like Dimir Demons doesn't currently exist in the metagame, it was a real force for about a month, and it put a real dampener on decks like Golgari Midrange. But to bring myself back on topic, I wanted to start by saying, and to reiterate something that Kira has brought up, pros love mid-range decks. In every Pro Tour where the format hasn't immediately been solved, especially in Standard, we've seen that mid-range decks are wildly overrepresented. The reason for this is that mid-range decks tend to have the most agency and skill expression. So if you're one of the top 200 players in the world, then you're more likely to succeed through using skill to eke out percentage points than with a deck with high variance matchups, typically something like a combo deck. It helps right now as well that a lot of the best decks in the metagame are mid-range or aggressive variants. So I'm talking Dimir, Pixie, and even to some extent, Black-Green.
It's super interesting as well mentioning Pixie in this spot, because we didn't see Pixie. We haven't seen Pixie in these last 2 events. And it is something that's been, from my experience, dominating the current Standard metagame. You cannot play, more than 2 games on Arena without seeing Pixie.
Pixie is a symptom of this ever-changing Standard format. It is a relatively new deck and has very quickly become quite dominant. So it is likely to be a force that we see at the Pro Tour just because of how strong it is, how interactive it is, and how many important play patterns it has in terms of executing them correctly. I'm going to talk for a second about archetype philosophy. Kira, what tends to beat up on mid-range decks?
What beats up on mid-range decks? I need to know.
Control decks. Oftentimes, excellent players will spike a Pro Tour top 8 by preying on pro players' love of mid-range decks. Really good examples of this are decks like the Dimir and Golgari Demons decks of recent memory, or perhaps more specifically, Shota Yasuoka's Grixis control deck from the Kaladesh era. It was a deck that he explicitly said he would not recommend playing outside of a Pro Tour environment, and that was reflected in the Standard play rates after the Pro Tour. Unfortunately for control decks, their biggest predator, which is powerful, hyper-aggressive strategies, are also in a dominant metagame position at the moment, from everything from green-red prowess, green-red mice, white-red mice, white-red burn. This means that the trade-off in percentage points for playing a control deck is actually much more severe than it otherwise would be, because the decks that prey on it are out in force. So what does this mean? Aggro, by virtue of its proactive strength, is likely to make up a significant metagame share. A good strategy when playing a professional event is just to play whatever the best deck is that is time-tested and robust and resilient, which is something that Green-Red has proven to be. Mid-range decks, that prey on aggro strategies are also likely to be overrepresented in the metagame by virtue of both professional players' preferences for the decks, as well as their good metagame positioning into the green-red aggro decks. The meta share for control will then be a function of players' reads on what they think the metagame will be. If they think that there's too much aggro to make control worthwhile, then it is likely to dip. But if they think that others will identify the prevalence of mid-range and move away from aggressive strategies, all of a sudden control will see an uptick. So what do I think? I think that players are going to hedge. I think instead of slower mid-range strategies, we'll see far more pixie and aggressively slanted mid-range decks, or mid-range decks with an end-the-game combo to beat up on control. A good example of this would be something like the mono-black mid-range decks of old, that are using 2-card lose half your life doubled combos to win the game out of nowhere. In terms of new decks to look out for, there are 3 packages that are new with Aetherdrift that I think you should look out for, and that I think will play a major part in how this Pro Tour goes down. The first one is something we've already talked about in our Aetherdrift pre-release episode, and that is Gas Guzzler, Bloodghast, and Sheoldred the Apocalypse.
3 of the yuckiest words I've heard uttered today in sequence, let's be honest.
It is a very powerful series of cards, individually and collectively, an absolutely ridiculous engine. This mono-black engine, I think, is likely to be seen paired with multiple different colours. Either black-red to pair into strong sacrifice themes, black-white to give you access to powerful graveyard synergies and sideboard synergies, or black-blue to give you more access to permission in a heavier control environment, or black-green to help you get there on speed and raw card quality, which in a mid-range heavy meta is likely to be quite important. The reason I think this will work best in an aggressive shell is because A, Bloodghast generates the most value as a card, outside of obviously in combo strategies, when it's in an aggressive strategy. When you are forcing your opponent to block a Bloodghast unfavorably, it feels amazing. The second reason is that max speed needs to be reached reliably in order to get into your powerful late game position for the engine. The presence of Sheoldred specifically helps you to claw back the lost life from incidental flyers, and Bloodghast all but blanks Tithing Blade effects out of Pixie. Sheoldred is also just one of the best cards against aggressive decks. It is a large blocking body with Death Touch that gains you a bunch of life. It's very strong. And with the assumed prevalence of the best deck in the format, probably, green-red, we can expect to see it show up more in the main deck and in the sideboard than we otherwise would have.
We will see Sheoldred in Standard until the literal day it rotates out. And I, for one, am eagerly counting down those days because the era of Sheoldred has been non-stop since its release.
It's funny you should say that, because right now Sheoldred's play rate is at an all-time low. We're seeing it pretty much exclusively as a 2-of in sideboards of blue-black, and that's it. It's such a powerful card, and it's not currently seeing main board play, which I think is absurd.
Relegate her to the sideboard.
Look, I don't think anybody will be upset about seeing less Sheoldred in Standard. The second engine I think we will see in at least relative force is Mendicant, Simulacrum Synthesizer, and Voyage Home.
This one gets me excited. I have been waiting for Simulacrum Synthesizer to get those shiny new toys, and Aetherdrift has provided it in spades.
This does need to be in an aggressive shell. This is for multiple reasons. The first is again because of max speed, which is what allows Mendicant to copy artifact spells, which is part of the late game engine. But it's also because it allows you to capitalize on the value from Voyage Home quickly. This is really important because as good as Simulacrum Synthesizer and Mendicant is, it is not going to go over the top of Sheoldred, Bloodghast, Gas Guzzler. As a result, you need to be playing it in an assertive strategy where you can leverage the card advantage, the cheap card advantage that you're getting from Voyage Home, in a way to close out the game before the late game end the game combinations of cards from the other mid-range decks come out. Simulacrum Synthesizer, though, if unchecked, especially in concert with Mendicant's copy ability, will close out basically any game very quickly, and it will provide an insurmountable wall of value against any ground-based mid-range deck. This is also likely the best deck for the Aether Spark, as any additional way to close out the game against grindier opponents is going to be welcome, and you have lots of artifacts and lots of high-power creatures to attach the Aether Spark to generate lots of value on that loyalty very quickly. Also, hard to interact with Planeswalkers is just always going to be good. Simulacrum Synthesizer, plus This Town Ain't Big Enough, plus Mendicant, creates an impressive explosion of value. Being able to use This Town Ain't Big Enough on, say, 2 Simulacrum Synthesizers, or even on 2 Memory Guardians with a Simulacrum Synthesizer in play, is going to generate you 4 Guardians and 4 Construct tokens, which are going to be a minimum of 8/8. And that's why I think this deck is good, because it has the capacity to close out the game so quickly. This deck is very powerful, but again will need to be more aggressive than the black-based mid-range decks. I think this deck will fall somewhere between the green-red aggressive decks and the black X mid-range decks, as it will eventually fall behind against Guzzler, Bloodghast, Sheoldred.
The other thing in terms of copying and making tokens, what we discussed about in our last episode is Maelstrom Pulse. And Golgari loves removal. Golgari loves efficient removal. Golgari loves unbridled removal that doesn't care what kind of permanent you control. And Maelstrom Pulse, being able to target a permanent and then destroy all permanents with the same name, everything you've copied shares the same name, the constructs share the same name. You'll have to be careful going up against, like you've said, those Black X mid-range decks that are looking to control the board state while you're looking to dominate it.
And green-black, depending on what pros think the meta share is going to look like, is actually likely to come out in force again in the Pro Tour, because it will end up with good matchups against other ground-based mid-range decks, which are likely to take up a lot of the field, and will also have a good matchup against this Mendicant strategy because of the presence of good multiple strike removal like Maelstrom Pulse. The last engine I wanted to talk to you about today is Ketramos and Ghost Vacuum. This is perhaps a little bit more niche, but this card draw combo makes a strong late-game threat that is the best combination of cheap, disruptive, and powerful. It's also in black, so there is a world where we see the Guzzler Sheoldred package share slots with this combination of cards, although I think it is unlikely because it takes up the same sort of engine slots. I think this is likely to be the slowest, most controlling of the mid-range decks, that is more likely to use incremental effects of Ketramos to accommodate playing lower power but more versatile cards. The deck will likely make or break depending on how good the card's Sunfall is in the metagame. But the main board hate cards, the good color pairing, and the strong card draw engine means that this deck is a real contender in the standard Pro Tour metagame, especially if they think that there is going to be a prevalence of decks that are utilizing the graveyard.
Ketramos is going to provide a lot of problems in terms of removal. It has indestructible. And so you're going to need, like you said, a Sunfall type ability to exile it to get around that indestructibility. And that means there are certain decks that will not be able to do that. Gruul Aggro, for example, is not going to have the ability to exile Ketramos. And so it's going to run up against Menace Lifelink Indestructible and just beat its little mice into the ground against it. And Sunfall being a 5-cost sorcery spell where Ketramos is a 3-cost creature, you at minimum have 3 turns before losing it to Sunfall potentially. And that, coupled with Ghost Vacuum, gives you at least 3 cards if you are able to hit graveyards properly. I foresee Ketramos being a problem, but I agree as well, like you said, it depends on the prevalence of those Sunfall type effects and whether or not people are predicting seeing it very much. If you're not thinking you're going to see Ketramos, you're not going to prepare for it. If people haven't figured out the best, deck to slot Ketramos into, what's the need to prepare for it?
It's funny how much the body of Ketramos is doing a lot of work as compared to just its draw a card ability, which is already very strong. A 4/4 Menace Lifelink Indestructible is hard to get through for any aggressive strategy and any mid-range strategy, and poses some real problems, even in the face of a very powerful 4-drop like Sheoldred.
Ketramos spits in Glissa's face, unfortunately.
It is... yes.
Ketramos is the Glissa counter we didn't know we needed. going up against First Strike Death Touch is not for the faint of heart. And the only card that can currently do it is a God card. So that should speak alone to Glissa's stat block and how good of a card Glissa is. Again, not even to mention the abilities that Glissa has when she deals combat damage. So 2 very powerful cards that are... Ketchamos is going to win out in that exchange, unfortunately, though, and that's going to hold back a lot of those Golgari mid-range decks. They're not going to send their Glissa face first into that.
Ketchamos is currently a $130 card.
AUD.
Australian dollars. And that is because as a body and as a card draw effect, it is likely to win both aggressive and mid-range mirrors. So we are likely to see a large amount of Ketchamos at the Pro Tour, regardless of whether or not we see a strong uptick in mid-range decks. The only deck that I think will be well positioned to beat Ketchamos is going to be those controlling decks that I talked about earlier. So that's kind of what I think the metagame will look like in terms of core engines, in terms of archetypes and strategies. So that brings us to our second question, which is, what do I think the best performing deck will be? And surprising maybe no one, my answer is spell-based combo.
Maya, you like combo?
I do. I think it's really strong.
This is a shocking prediction from you.
Crazy, I know. But it is based on more than just my personal biases. I think that spell-based combo decks are going to be uniquely well-placed in a metagame that is featuring lots of must-kill creatures and slower clocks than red-green. Exactly what this spell-based combo deck of the season will be is not clear. I expect we won't see it until the pros bring it out at the Pro Tour, but I expect it will make the most of beans and This Town Ain't Big Enough. It will be slower and resilient to 1 or 2 pieces of hand hate like Duress, and I think a good example of a deck that is similar to this kind of deck would be something like the blue-white Abuelos combo. I don't think it will be that deck in specific because it is still weak to a creature removal spell, but it will be a deck of that ilk. Something that is designed to prey upon the series of dead removal slots in your opponent's main deck, and that doesn't fall to 1 or 2 pieces of hand hate out of the sideboard. I am very curious to see what this deck ends up being. The third question that we wanted to answer was, what do I think the card of the tournament will be? And shocking maybe no one, it is Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Again, yes, sigh.
Put her in the sideboard. Relegate her to the sideboard.
If only, right? If only. Aetherdrift has provided us with a ton of new and very powerful card draw engines that allow each mid-range deck to fight and go over the top of one another using angles that haven't historically existed. So Sheoldred is going to be in a prime position to capitalize on the shift towards specifically card draw value, especially with some of the decks that made it hard to play, like Pixie, losing some ground with the presence of Bloodghast interacting with their sacrifice effects. Additionally, Sheoldred is one of the best ways to stabilize against an aggressive strategy like Mice, which is almost certainly going to have a significant portion of the metagame. It's good. It's always been good. It will continue to be good. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
This is going to be a very exciting Pro Tour, and it is going to set the stage for the rest of the year's events. This is the first of a series of Pro Tours mirroring what we saw last year. We were going to have Chicago, Atlanta, and Vegas.
The big 3.
The big 3. This event is going to set the stage for Standard. However, as with Dimir Demons and this Grixis Kaladesh list that you've mentioned as well, there is oftentimes a propensity of the best decks at World to not be represented in your local metagame. Dimir Demons fell off incredibly quickly, and that was because people figured the answers out to the deck fairly quickly. Remove Unholy Annex, make sure they have no card advantage, destroy any demon on site. You're going to put yourself in a decently good position.
Turns out playing 4 mana for a 6/6 in a world with Go for the Throat is just not that good.
It just ends up dying. Or at worst, it gets bounced. It's a token. It ceases to exist. You can bounce it to their hand and it just disappears. So seeing which decks pull out in the field, which decks pull ahead in the professional scene is going to be super interesting, and seeing how that then trickles down to the rest of the field at your local game store, at your FNM is going to be very interesting because for a while, Dimir Demons decks were rampant. They were all over Arena. You could get the Dimir Demons deck on Arena as a pre-built deck. You could buy the deck on Arena for a while. You could also buy one of the Gruul Prowess lists, one of the Golgari mid-range lists. Very, very cool thing that was done, and then everyone stopped playing it. There are still variations of it that are running around on Arena, and occasionally you see them pop up at a local event, but there's nowhere near the prevalence that you may have expected for a Worlds level deck. And so seeing the way in which these decks are going to influence the meta, or in some way de-influence the meta, is going to be really cool.
I am looking forward to the inevitable shift of whatever the best deck at the Pro Tour was being absolutely everywhere, and then whatever deck beats that deck becoming absolutely everywhere, and then the format self-correcting into probably what it should be over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. I love post-Pro Tour Standard because I think it's a really interesting time to brew. There's so much volatility because the format has been shaken up by the best players in the game that when you sit down to play it, you almost never know what you're expecting because the format very quickly becomes a Pro Tour format as opposed to the standard, iterative, back and forth, find until we solve the format style of gameplay. Instead, it is going to be a format that was designed to solve for a Pro Tour metagame, which is just so different. The other thing I'm really excited to see is Aether Drift. It's going to shake up Standard, whether we like it or not. And I love Standard as it is now, but I'm so excited by the new set and the powerful cards that seem to be in every color and archetype. It will shake Standard up into being something new and exciting, and that is always a wonderful thing.
We will be back with a metagame breakdown post-Pro Tour. I literally can't wait. I want the weekend to be here now. I can't wait to see what bubbles to the surface. I can't wait to see what sinks to the bottom. Seeing what isn't cutting it at the pro level is always super exciting as well. And we're going to dive into a breakdown of the most played decks in Standard, a couple of the least played decks, the most played cards. We're going to look at the winning decks and some of the top 5 as well. I cannot wait. This is going to be such an exciting weekend for Standard. And we'll be back very soon with another episode breaking all of that down.
With all that said, that is all that we have time for today. We look forward to seeing you again on Monday after the Pro Tour. New episodes release on Mondays at 11 AM Australian Eastern Standard Time. And until then, you can keep track of all our releases at Raise MTG on both Instagram and Blue Sky. You can find Kira on the same platforms at kirabobira.jpg and myself at MayaMTG. Thank you to the State Library of Victoria for their ongoing use of their space. And until next week, remember, Gix failed. I shall not.